The Nintendo Wii is arguably the most important console ever made. Not only is it one of Nintendo's best-selling consoles of all time, it served as the best entry-level video game console ever made. There are countless people who had never played video games before, but when you gave them the Wiimote, they said, "What am I supposed to do, sit on it?" Nintendo has always been one of the most popular console manufacturers of all time. The Super Nintendo, the N64, and the GameCube all did pretty well. And their handheld consoles, the Game Boy Advance, and the DS were all incredibly popular. But Nintendo was running into some issues. A lot of people who used to be fans of the earliest Nintendo consoles were moving on to more powerful units like the Xbox and the PlayStation. And before the release of the Wii, the GameCube did decently well. But during the early 2000s, technology was advancing at a rate that was unreal. And during the GameCube's lifecycle, Nintendo ended up making a decision that would cost them millions of dollars. And that was using a unique form of discs that were only for the GameCube. The original Xbox and the PlayStation and PlayStation 2 used a traditional DVD format disc that allowed so much more storage than what was available on the GameCube. And with technology progressing as much as it was and games getting bigger and bigger, it was time for Nintendo to make a dramatic change, which led to the development of the Wii. The Xbox and the PlayStation marketed themselves towards the traditional gamer. Their goal was to make devices that catered towards the hardcore gamers. That's me. And even though the GameCube was more powerful than consoles at the time, Nintendo quickly realized they weren't going to be able to compete in the hardcore gaming market, and they ended up making a pivot that made them stand out in ways that are still being felt to this day. Nintendo's leadership, including President Satoru Iwata and generational talent like Shigeru Miyamoto, decided to innovate rather than try and compete with market giants like PlayStation and Xbox. And they began to conceptualize ideas to make a console that would stand out and attract not only people who were seasoned gamers, but people who had never played a video game before in their life. So who are you targeting with this console? Everyone. Now, looking back, this was a bold move from Nintendo. If you imagine the standard bell curve, most people fall right into the middle. And that would be your typical gamers to any capacity. On the left side, you have people who don't play video games or only do very sparingly. And on the right, you have people who live and breathe video games as their entire existence. So trying to target the majority and the minority was an incredibly bold move. Originally, the Wii was codenamed Revolution, and the goal was to create an intuitive gaming experience for all ages. Their goal was to be something the other consoles on the market were not, and that was a family-friendly entertainment system. For a lot of people, if you handed your dad or your grandmother a game controller, they would absolutely melt. I do not like this. So when they were developing the Wii, they went with the idea of motion controls. Almost every console at the time had a standard controller. From the early ages of Atari's joystick to the GameCube controller, most consoles had fallen into a similar pattern. But Nintendo wanted to push the envelope, and they created the design for the Wiimote and Nunchuck. Compared to the GameCube controller, the Wiimote was a bold move. Instead of the typical design of a controller which fits in both hands easily, Nintendo designed the Wiimote to resemble a simple TV remote. And throughout gaming history, there were a lot of controllers that tried to resemble a TV remote, and all of them were absolute trash. But what made the Wiimote really stand out was the inclusion of motion controls. A standard TV remote uses infrared technology and nothing else. But Nintendo wanted to really stand out, and they included a 3-axis accelerometer. Oh, what? What this did is it allowed the Wiimote to detect tilt, motion, and acceleration in all directions. It allowed the Wii to track your motion and created endless opportunities for the inclusion of motion controls. The Wiimote had your standard buttons and could be used as a traditional controller, but I mean, come on, is anyone playing the Wii without swinging this around like an absolute maniac? They even had a speaker built into the controller, which allowed a lot of games the ability to play immediate audio feedback, which for the time was absolutely insane. You would be playing New Super Mario Bros. And your controller would just tell you, "You stink at this game." Hey. But beyond just the Wiimote, they also included a nunchuck. It was the secondary controller that plugged directly into the Wiimote, and it included an extra set of buttons, an accelerometer just like the Wiimote, and something that was missing from the Wiimote, an analog stick. And though it wasn't needed for every game on the console, in the games it was included, it didn't feel like a hassle to use. And the controls of this console brought a new meaning to hands-on gameplay experience that to this day have really been yet to be replicated. There were other consoles even at the time that were trying to replicate this, with the Xbox's Kinect and the PlayStation Move, but there was a reason that the Wii was in a class of its own. It was designed from the ground up as motion control being its main gimmick, and it wasn't an afterthought trying to capitalize on the Wii's success. And that's not to say the Wiimote and Nunchuck were perfect, because it did have its fair share of issues. The earliest version of the Wiimote was not as accurate as you might want, and unlike other consoles at the time, the Wiimote ran on 2 AA batteries instead of being plugged directly into the console, which single-handedly kept the Energizer Bunny off the streets. There was also the issue that the Wiimote quickly became a projectile if not used properly. The Wiimote included a safety strap that a lot of people neglected to use, which led to countless TVs being absolutely dismantled by a Wiimote going Mach 7 right into the screen. But overall, the Wii did something incredibly unique. A lot of people at the time were expressing how the Wiimote was not made for people who wanted a traditional gaming experience. And though they ended up creating things like the classic controller that brought that experience to the console, what they lacked in the typical gaming experience, they created in brand new opportunities. But using the Wiimote and Nunchuck weren't the only ways to play games on this console. The Wii also did something that no Nintendo home console had ever done before, and that was include backwards compatibility with their last console. If you tried to put an N64 cartridge into a GameCube, you were going to have a bad time. But with the Wii, they took a note out of the DS's playbook and decided to make the console backwards compatible with the GameCube's library. The GameCube had a very short life cycle, which made a lot of people who owned that console disappointed a new Nintendo console was coming out so soon. But the fact that there was complete backwards compatibility with all GameCube games was an absolute game changer. Though Nintendo wanted to expand into new territory, they didn't want to alienate their current customer base. So including backwards compatibility not only allowed them to save face with their current customers, but it also included a much larger library for people to access even on day one. But even though ending the GameCube's lifecycle early could have created a lot of bad blood, the ability to play all of these games plus the entire new library that was coming to the console made it so it was much easier for Nintendo fans to transition to the new hardware than it could have been, which led to the console being announced to the public at E3 2005. And though the E3 2005 showing didn't introduce the idea of motion controls, it was still the first time that we ever got to see the Wii. But we ended up seeing the motion controls revealed at the Tokyo Game Show in September 2005, where we got to see the console in action for the first time. And then in April of 2006, we finally got the name the Wii.
No, they're just for me.
The idea behind the branding was simple but brilliant. Nintendo announced that the idea behind it was that Wii sounds like Wii.
That is genius.
And the idea is that the console was made for everybody, not just your traditional gamers, but people around the world. It was like a board game where anyone can pick up and play it, and it didn't matter if this was your first time or your 1000th time playing a video game, you could play it and enjoy it. And that led to the launch of the Wii, which released on November 19th, 2006 in North America, December 2nd, 2006 in Japan, December 8th, 2006 in Europe, and December 7th, 2006 in Australia. The holiday season of 2006 was incredibly fierce. The Xbox 360 had released a year prior and had already built a sizable customer base, especially in the United States. But in early November, the Wii and the PS3 had both released, which led to one of the most insane holiday seasons of all time. A lot of people might not remember this, but Black Friday back in the day used to have people lining up at the doors and fist fighting over deals. And that was the case in 2006, where people were lining up at the doors and fighting one another to get their hands on the new Nintendo or Sony consoles. But the Wii did pretty well, mainly because all of the new features, launch titles, and pack-in titles that made this console something that everybody had to have. The Wii offered something that older Nintendo consoles didn't, and that was built-in online connectivity. Similar to a television, the Wii offered a bunch of different channels. You had your weather channel, which showed you exactly what it sounds like, the weather.
Incredible!
You had the Wii Shop channel, which was Nintendo's first foray into the world of digital gaming, where you could buy and download apps, WiiWare games, and virtual console games, which made it so there were more offerings than ever before for your console, including the huge selection of digital retro games, which was an incredible deal, and a load of WiiWare exclusive games, which were mostly fine. A lot of WiiWare games were terrible, but some of them could be really fun. But the last and most notable feature to me was the Mii Maker. Mii's have become iconic to this day because they allow people to personify themselves in a video game character. This was not the first time a company or N64 game had done this, including Nintendo themselves having a similar version to this on the N64 disk drive. But the fact that you could use Miis to create yourself and others and implement them into the games themselves was positively groundbreaking for the time. I'm sure I'm not the only one who spent far too long making Miis, but it was so simple yet so fun. Now, excluding launch titles, that was already enough for day one console content. Old consoles like the GameCube and the N64 would not work if you didn't have a game for them. So the fact that you could do things like check the weather was insane. But Nintendo went above and beyond and included a brand new game with every single console, and that was Wii Sports. Wii Sports is one of the most iconic video games ever made. It was a strategic move by Nintendo to include a console tie-in game that showed off the strength the Wii had to offer, with a simple sports game that highlighted the motion controls of the console better than any game ever could. Wii Sports offered 5 separate simple sports games for anyone to pick up and play. You had tennis, which played just like a typical tennis game, where you would serve the tennis ball from side to side and try and win the tennis match. You had baseball, which played just like a typical baseball game, where you used the motion controls to throw the ball and swing the bat. You had arguably the most iconic, which was bowling, which played just like you were at the bowling alley throwing bowling balls down the line to knock over pins. You had golf, which allowed you to play a full 18 holes from the comfort of your home. And you had boxing, which allowed you to beat the snot out of anybody in your path. What made Wii Sports absolutely iconic was not just the fact that it was packed in with every Wii console, giving everybody who bought the console a game that had endless replayability, and it wasn't even the fact that you could include your Mii characters into the game to add a level of personification that had been unattempted in other games, but it was the fact that it was so simple and accessible that anyone could play it. You had young children, parents, and grandparents all playing the same video game together with a negligible learning curve and a gameplay loop that was endlessly satisfying. It was the perfect pack-in title for the Wii because it did exactly what the console was designed to do: bridge the gap between gamers and non-gamers and create a console that was perfect for anybody to pick up and use. But that wasn't the only option to play on day one for the Wii. Not only was there a huge catalog of GameCube games to play, but there was also some incredible launch titles for the console. The most notable being The Legend of Zelda: Twilight Princess. Having a Zelda game as a launch title for a Nintendo console was a good omen. Not only was it a return to form for the 3D Zelda games, but it also highlighted a lot of the Wii's strengths. Twilight Princess released for both the GameCube and the Wii. The GameCube version played more like a typical Zelda game, but the Wii version offered motion controls built in to enhance the experience. And there were some technical changes between the two, most notably Link's sword being on either the left side for the GameCube version or the right side for the Wii version. Throughout history, Link has always been a left-handed swordsman, but the problem is most people are right-handed. So in order to make the game feel more organic, they moved Link's sword to his right hand. But regardless of what console you get it for, Twilight Princess is a great game. It's a 3D Zelda game, which is already great, but this time Link turns into a wolf.
This game's gonna make me bark.
Before Twilight Princess, the last Zelda game was Wind Waker, which had a much different feel compared to other Zelda games in the series, and a lot of fans wanted the return to form this game offered. It has a very cinematic and dark atmosphere compared to any other Zelda game, and as a launch title, it over-delivered on what it needed to. A lot of launch titles throughout history are just fine, but this was absolutely incredible. Another great launch title was Super Monkey Ball Banana Blitz, which took the iconic Super Monkey Ball series and brought it into the world of motion controls. And for anybody who's ever played a Monkey Ball game, you would know that motion controls are a weird choice. Don't get me wrong, it was a great idea, and it ends up playing really well, but I can only imagine how many Wiimotes this game in particular caused to break. Because on the GameCube, this game was already difficult, but having to control it with motion controls was like pulling teeth blindfolded. To control the game, you had to tilt the Wiimote, and that was fine, but it also could lead to you wanting to break everything in your surroundings. But it was a Monkey Ball game, so you were going to have a great time because the gameplay itself was just really addicting. If you haven't played a Monkey Ball game, I highly recommend it, but this might not be the best one to start out with. And another incredibly iconic launch title was Rayman Raving Rabbids. The idea of Rabbids give me chest pain. From the launch of the Wii onward, Rabbids were everywhere. You couldn't go to a store that sold video games without seeing one of these somewhere. But for me, Rabbids are like Minions, where it doesn't really do anything for me. A lot of people love these things, and that's fine, but I only really like them in certain contexts. And Raving Rabbids was fine. Shooting plungers at anything is gonna be a good time, especially with how well this game introduced motion controls, but there's nothing that really stands out to make this a great game. This was a Rayman game, but the Rabbids ended up taking the center stage, which stinks because Rayman is a great character who doesn't get enough attention. And I'm not gonna say you should not check out this game, because it is fun, but just know you'll never be able to sleep again without seeing this in your nightmares.
Oh, it was the Rabbids.
And there were a ton of launch titles that I didn't talk about, like Call of Duty 3, Excite Truck, Marvel Ultimate Alliance, and Red Steel, which were all incredible, and loads more that made the launch of this console have an impressive library right off the start. Out of the gate, the Wii had a ton of third-party support, which was extremely impressive considering how gimmicky this console could have been. Motion controls were a hard thing to develop for, especially because no one was doing it at the time. But the fact that they had so many good games right off the rip really helped the Wii stand out, especially with so much competition during its launch year. But there were a few more games that came out in 2006 after the launch of the console that really helped the Wii stand out even more. The first of which being Wii Play.
I feel like this name is gonna start a trend.
Now, depending on where you live in the world, this could have been a launch title for the console, but in North America, it wasn't. Wii Play is very similar to Wii Sports, having a bunch of simple micro games that showed off the motion controls for the console. It had 9 small games that were all infinitely replayable, but just not as flushed out and fun as the Wii Sports titles. But that's not to say that any of these were that bad. In fact, I like a lot of these just as much as I like the Wii Sports games. You had a Duck Hunt style shooting range, which allowed you to play a similar version to Duck Hunt using the Wii's motion controls. You had a Find Me minigame where you try and find a me throughout a crowd of characters on a screen. You had a standard table tennis minigame, which was great, and you could even play pool on this, which made it an incredible time. Now, Wii Play has always lived in the shadow of Wii Sports, but it ended up being one of the best-selling games on the entire console, but I mainly think that was because it was bundled with a Wiimote. It was only a little bit more to buy the Wii Play bundle than it was to buy a Wiimote on its own, so if you were going to get it, you might as well spend a few extra dollars and get a game to go along with it. And considering most Wii bundles only came with one controller, it was well worth the cost. But even if you got this game on its own, it was still a great time. But during an extremely competitive launch year, the Wii did a lot to really stand out. It had a great selection of launch and pack-in titles, plus the ability to play all the old GameCube games, which gave any early adopter a ton of content to play from day one. But considering it released in November and December pretty much across the world, there wasn't a lot of time in 2006 to release a lot of games. But in 2007, they had more than enough time and resources to put everything they had into the console. And they started out strong in January with the release of WarioWare Smooth Moves. If you've played a WarioWare game, you'll understand the appeal. But if you haven't, this might sound like a weird game. WarioWare is a series of micro games. Your goal is to complete a bunch of these games in a row without messing up a certain amount of times, and the variety in the micro games keeps you on your toes the entire time you're playing. A lot of third-party developers and even Nintendo's own in-house development team struggled to implement motion controls well, but that was not the case for WarioWare. Adding movement to small micro games just worked. They didn't have to do anything crazy like building a new game mechanic from the ground up, they just had to implement movement into their pre-existing games. And considering each game only lasted about 5 seconds, you didn't have enough time to really get super in-depth, which made it so even if the motion controls weren't perfect, you could still work past it. I am a huge fan of every WarioWare game, they're all incredible to me, but this one in particular holds a special place in my heart because of how good of a game it really is. WarioWare is one of Nintendo's most slept on series, and if you ever have a chance to play it, I really hope you check it out. In February, we got Sonic and the Secret Rings, which was the first storybook Sonic game, and it was interesting to say the least. Compared to the other 3D Sonic games we'd had, this was very different. Where in Sonic Adventure and Sonic Adventure 2, you could kind of free roam around any given area, Sonic and the Secret Rings offered an on-the-rails system that kept you going in the right direction the entire time. It felt more as if it was a hybrid between a 2D Sonic game and a 3D Sonic game, but not in the best way. Part of the fun of 3D platformers is that you can go wherever you want and traverse the 3D landscape, but you couldn't do that here. But the game itself wasn't bad, it just was very different compared to a lot of other Sonic games we'd had. It did have a great party mode that was loads of fun, so overall it's not the best game ever, but it's definitely not that bad. In April we saw the release of Super Paper Mario, which was the first Mario game we got on this console, and it did a lot of things differently. Up until Super Paper Mario, the game featured a turn-based RPG battle mechanic, and they completely got rid of that for this entry, which was very strange, but it worked kind of well. It had a unique mechanic where you transition from a 2D to a 3D environment, which allowed you to literally see the world from a different perspective. But it left a lot of fans who were expecting a game more in line to the older Paper Mario titles disappointed. But for what it lacked in RPG mechanics, it made up for with an incredible story. It was dark in ways that Mario games rarely ever are, and it had really great writing throughout the entire story, so regardless if you were a Paper Mario fan or just a casual Mario fan, you would enjoy it. So for a lot of people, this was an A+, but for a lot of others, they wanted to crumple it up and throw it away.
I just got a cease and desist from telling paper jokes.
In May, we saw the release of Mario Party 8, a brand new game that brought Mario Party into the world of motion controls. It was the typical Mario Party experience where you'd roll dice, collect stars, and play mini-games, but this time everything was enhanced by motion controls. And I mean enhanced because this played really well. On the GameCube, there were 4 separate Mario Party titles, and by the end of the GameCube's life cycle, they were kind of played out. They were all fun, but year after year we were getting new titles and they weren't innovating as much as they could. But with the addition of motion controls, they added so much variety to the game, it was great. There were so many great stages and mini games that really made this stand out, and though at the time it wasn't considered to be the best Mario Party, it was the last game before the series went into its dark ages, so looking back, I don't think it was as bad as people thought it was. In June, we got the release of Big Brain Academy Wii Degree, which was a brain training game that was kind of similar to WarioWare, but instead of focusing on random micro games, it had small learning instruments, and it was a game that appealed to a section of people who weren't typically gamers. The whole point of the game was to improve cognitive function by doing small puzzles, but I would really like to see if this game helped anybody anywhere in the world with cognitive function. This is the video game equivalent of homework, so I'm not a huge fan of it, but if you're a fan of this kind of game, I'm not going to fault you. But I am going to assume you're the kind of person who would tell the teacher if they forgot to hand out the homework. Also in June, we got the release of Resident Evil 4 Wii Edition, which took my favorite Resident Evil game and enhanced it with motion controls. I'm not the biggest fan of survival horror games. I know that probably makes me a coward, but I don't like when things pop out and scare me and I pee myself. But this game at least offers a pretty solid gameplay loop, and you get to play as Leon Kennedy, so it was a pretty solid time. There's a reason that Resident Evil has become a household name, and it definitely wasn't because of the movies, so I enjoy this game even if it means I'm gonna soil my linens. In July, we saw the release of Mario Strikers Charge, the first Mario sports game on the console. It was a Mario soccer game, and it was absolutely incredible. It was all the fun of Mario sports with a load more violence. It had an almost comic book art style to it, but it took a very different approach to the Mario Sports series than any other Mario Sports game did. When you play Mario Golf or Mario Tennis, you're in for a lighthearted time. But when you're playing Mario Strikers, it's like you're playing in a dystopian Mario universe. You don't have to be a fan of soccer or football to enjoy this, and in my opinion, this is far better than the version we got for the Switch. On the same day at the end of August, we got the release of 2 games that, while different, both did extremely well, with the first being Carnival Games, which is a game that has been engraved into my skull and I can't seem to get it out. Carnival Games is exactly what you would think, a collection of carnival games for the Wii. I'm not gonna lie, I don't know who was asking for this. I've never been at my house thinking I want to play skee-ball right now. But I guess it's better than going to Chuck E. Cheese and having this thing look at me. Now, Carnival Games didn't do anything that incredible. Similar to Wii Sports, it was a collection of small games that allowed you to use the motion controls of the console to reenact things that you could do in real life. But where Wii Sports and Wii Play really stood out for making something that was fun, Carnival Games really leaned into the creepy atmospheres that carnivals already have and made a game that is disturbing but still somewhat fun. I don't trust this man. I feel like he's committed heinous crimes. But on the same day, we also got Metroid Prime 3 Corruption, another Metroid Prime game, but this time it included motion controls. Similar to the other Metroid Prime games for the GameCube, you were moving around and blasting things as Samus, while solving puzzles and uncovering secrets that made the series stand out as much as it does today. It might be a hot topic, but I actually really like playing this game series on the Wii. A lot of people prefer to play it with a controller like on the GameCube, and if they were to port Metroid Prime 2 and 3 over to modern Nintendo hardware using a controller, I'd probably prefer it that way. But as of right now, if it's between playing these games on the GameCube or on the Wii, I'm gonna probably pick the Wii. But Metroid Prime is iconic for a reason. It has great puzzles, interesting level design, and tons of lore. So if you haven't played them yet, I absolutely recommend checking them out. In October, there was the release of Guitar Hero 3 Legends of Rock, which is a game series that really defined the early 2000s, but as time has gone on, a lot of people have forgot these games exist. I love Guitar Hero even if I'm absolutely terrible at it, but of course it had a great soundtrack and really great gameplay that was endlessly playable, so there's a reason that people play to this day. But in 2007, the most important game that released for the Wii was Super Mario Galaxy. Super Mario Galaxy answered the age-old question:
what if we put Mario in space?
3D Mario games have always been some of the best games on any Nintendo console, and this was no exception. Mario Galaxy has you exploring the cosmos as Mario, and for some reason he doesn't need a spacesuit, but we're not going to talk about that, I guess. But it did what Mario does best and changed the Mario formula while still keeping the authentic Mario feel. Unlike in Super Mario 64 and Super Mario Sunshine, this game had a huge focus on gravity-based mechanics. When you jump towards a planet or anything else in orbit, it has its own gravity, which attracts you back to the surface of that planet, and it allowed Nintendo to create some of the most incredible level design they ever have. Like I said before, a lot of games struggled to implement motion controls in a way that enhanced the experience, but Mario Galaxy did this perfectly. You would use the Wiimote to collect star bits and have Mario twist in the air, and it only ever felt like it enhanced the gameplay experience. I'm sure the argument could be made that it would be better if you could play Mario Galaxy using a controller, but I can't sit here and say this game was not incredible all the way through. It has one of the best soundtracks in video game history, and if you haven't played Mario Galaxy, I feel like you should be sent to prison. If you haven't already, you need to check this out because it's one of the best Wii games ever made. In the same month, we also got the release of Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games, the first time we ever saw Mario and Sonic in the same video game. Now, historically, I have been very critical of the Mario and Sonic games, but having replayed all of them recently, I will say that I think I was being too harsh. The first Mario and Sonic game is arguably the weakest, considering it served as a proof of concept for the series and it didn't do a lot of things that made the other games incredible, but it still had a lot of value, especially as an early Wii game. It had a load of Mario and Sonic characters competing in various Olympic events, and although a lot of them were very simple, it offered a good amount of fun to be had. Now, watching Mario and Sonic have a foot race has never really clicked in my head. Sonic's whole thing is that he's extremely fast, and Mario's just a plump Italian man, so the fact that he can beat him in a foot race is beyond my comprehension. But overall, if you're looking for a collection of fun mini games to play, this is not a bad time. But I would recommend checking out any of the other ones over this. Also in November, we got Link's crossbow training. This wasn't a standalone game, it was bundled in with the new Wii Zapper, but it uses a lot of the assets from Twilight Princess to make a game where Link practices shooting his crossbow. It's a target shooting game and it's not that incredible. You're just using the Wii Zapper to blast targets in random locations in a Zelda game, and I don't think that the Wii Zapper was a must-have accessory by any means. On the spot, I don't think I could come up with another game that used the Wii Zapper well, but overall, Link's crossbow training was pretty fun if you wanted to buy the accessory. I can't say it was worth going out and buying a Wii Zapper for, but if you wanted to treat yourself, I can't see why it would be a bad time. But 2007 was an incredible year for the Wii. It was its first full year on the market and it did a lot of things to make it really stand out. You had games that catered to pretty much anyone. For your non-traditional gamers, you had stuff like Big Brain Academy and Carnival games. And for your hardcore gamers, you had games like Metroid Prime and Resident Evil 4. And considering this was its first year on the market, it showed the Wii wasn't going anywhere. And Nintendo kept that momentum into 2008. Which was another incredible year for the console, and it all started in January with the release of No More Heroes. No More Heroes is one of those game series that I don't hear enough people talking about. It's one of the most satisfying games on the entire console, and it doesn't matter if you're cutting through enemies or mowing the grass, the game is just an incredibly over-the-top and enjoyable time for anybody who wants to pick it up. Now, I wouldn't recommend getting this game for a child like was done for me, but as a kid it was something I absolutely loved, and to this day it's one of my favorite Wii games. So I highly recommend checking it out. In March, we got the second most important game that released this year with Super Smash Bros. Brawl. You could say this is the most important because of how great this game is, and it really is interchangeable with the top spot, which is the next game, but Super Smash Bros. Brawl is extremely iconic. In the modern day, it's kind of the black sheep of the Smash Bros. Franchise, because it's not as competitive as games like Melee and Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, but for what it lacks in competitive gameplay, it makes up for with a wealth of single-player content. It was the first Smash Bros. Game to feature a full story mode, which showed characters teaming up in unlikely duos like Fox and Diddy Kong, and Samus and Pikachu, which was great to see on its own, but it also included a bunch of firsts for the series, like the inclusion of non-Nintendo characters for the first time, with Sonic and Solid Snake, and a wealth of other single-player game modes like the Stage Builder and the Masterpiece mode, which for the time and even to this day gives this the most complete feeling a Smash Bros. Game could possibly have. I love Super Smash Bros. Brawl, and I know a lot of people wanted a game that was more similar to Melee, but if you can get past that, you're in for an incredible time. And just over a month later, we got the release of Mario Kart Wii, which is arguably the most important game for the console this year. It's Mario Kart. Everybody has played this at least once, and it's one of Nintendo's most popular franchises of all time. It's gotten to the point where Mario Kart is going to perform better than the typical Mario games do on any given console, because it not only appeals to the hardcore gamers, but also people who don't really play video games. Regardless of who you are, you know someone who doesn't really play video games but will actually play Mario Kart. It did a lot of things to make the series stand out, like including a bunch of tracks from past games, including a bunch of great new characters like Rosalina, Funky Kong, and Dry Bowser, and including motorcycles for the first time, which made this the premier Mario Kart experience on this console and one of the best Mario Kart games of all time. I believe Mario Kart Wii is what made Mario Kart as popular as it is today, because this game came included with the Wii Wheel bundle, which made it so anyone could plug their Wiimote directly into this little peripheral and drive their Mario Karts like you would drive a car. But just like Wii Sports, Mario Kart was the perfect example of a game that appealed to everyone. And in May, we got another incredibly important game, and that was Wii Fit. Now, Wii Fit is not the most fun game you'll ever have, but it did something that no other Wii game really did, and that was change the stigma on gaming as a whole. Now, prior to the release of Wii Fit, you had some games that required movement, like Dance Dance Revolution, but even though that was a workout, it was more of a fun rhythm game than anything else, where Wii Fit's entire purpose was to bring exercising to families across the world. What Wii Fit did was not make a great game, but it was change the stigma that video games are for lazy people only. And now more than ever, I disagree with that stigma, but for a lot of people, especially in the early 2000s, video games had a stigma of only being for lazy people and kids. And thanks to Wii Sports and Wii Fit, I think that stigma has gone away over time. Wii Fit came with a balance board, and it had a bunch of built-in activities for people to do. Whether it was yoga or strength training, there were different things to keep your body moving that took the idea of motion controls to an entirely new level. For a lot of games, they took the idea of motion controls on the Wii and enhanced their games with it by adding small amount of motion controls to keep you more engaged while playing. And some games like Wii Sports had you up and moving for the majority of the time you're playing, but with Wii Fit, the entire purpose of the game was to get you in shape. It was really the first time that a video game was made for wellness. And as much as you can clown on this game for not being that great of a game, you can't dismiss the fact that it's one of the most important games on the console. In August, we saw the release of Mario Super Sluggers, the Mario baseball game that is arguably one of the best ever made, mostly because I love this game, but also because I really like how this game used the motion controls. It was a simple baseball game starring Mario characters where you swing at the right time, and it played just like a normal baseball game. And just like the GameCube game that came before it, it was a great time. Sure, it has its issues, but it has so much variety, a great story mode, and a great amount of content to keep you playing. And maybe I'm up on my high nostalgia horse, but I absolutely adore this game. I don't even like baseball, but I will play this game until I no longer can. I really want a new Mario baseball game, and I know the modern Mario sports games haven't come out with the most content, but I'm hopeful that if they make a new Mario baseball game, it will be the dawn of a new age of Mario sports content. I'm definitely being overly optimistic, but I feel like they would do it well. In September, we saw the release of Wario Land Shake It, a new Wario Land game. Similar to WarioWare, I'm a huge fan of the Wario Land series. It was the first Wario Land game to be released on a home console, and it was an absolutely incredible time. It had an animation art style that was extremely unique because the game looked like a cartoon. It played like a typical 2D platformer where you're going around exploring different locations, but this time Wario had the ability to shake the life out of anything he touched. As far as Wario Land games go, this has quickly become one of my favorite. As a kid, I didn't appreciate it as much as I should have, but with the art style and the fluidity of the gameplay, to this day I think it's one of the most slept on 2D platformers Nintendo has ever made. If you have the ability to play it, I absolutely recommend checking it out. And if Nintendo's watching this, please give us a new Wario Land game. In November, we saw the release of Animal Crossing City Folk, and it's an Animal Crossing game, so at base, it's gonna be pretty good, and this is my second favorite Animal Crossing, right behind New Leaf. Animal Crossing has always been Nintendo's go-to comfort series. With the clock-based mechanics and a world that progresses at the same time as ours, it leads to a meaningful connection with the world that you create. Now, any Animal Crossing game you play, you're gonna be an indentured servant to Tom Nook for at least the first 10 hours of the game. But just like any other Animal Crossing game, it's so satisfying to catch bugs, go fishing, and talk to the villagers in your town. And even though it's not an action-packed thrill ride, it scratches a different itch. It's a life sim game where you get what you put into it. It's great to pop in and check on your world every once in a while, and having the comfort of that on the Wii is absolutely incredible. But 2008 was an incredible year to own a Wii. You had absolute titans of games like Mario Kart and Smash Bros. Release, along with some lesser known but still incredible titles like Wario Land and No More Heroes. And though it didn't have as many games come out as 2007 did, the games that did come out were absolute heavy hitters. And that led to 2009, where Nintendo kept the momentum going once again. And it started with the release of some older titles that got ported over with some new features, starting with New Play Control Mario Power Tennis. Now, Mario Power Tennis was a game that originally released on the GameCube, but instead of getting a sequel game like we did with Mario Strikers and Mario Baseball, they ended up just adding motion controls to the game that already existed. Which is fine, but I really would have loved to get a new Mario Tennis for the Wii. Now, Mario Super Sluggers didn't sell as well as it could have, mainly because every single person who bought a Wii console had a pack-in title that included baseball. So instead of building a new Mario Tennis game from the ground up that might not sell that well, they decided to save time and money by porting over the GameCube version with new enhancements like motion controls. And that's fine, but I really would have loved to have a Mario Tennis game that played similar to how Wii Sports did. But overall, it doesn't matter if you're playing this on the GameCube or the Wii, it's gonna be a great time. I just hate the box art design for the new Play Control games. It did not look great. But we also got another new Play Control game on the same day, and that was New Play Control Pikmin. I love the Pikmin games, and honestly, I feel like they play better on the Wii than they do on the GameCube. That's not to say they play poorly on the GameCube, I just love being able to point and throw my Pikmin that way. There's something so engaging about playing them in this fashion that I just cannot get enough of. It was the perfect game for them to add motion control support to, because it didn't take away from the experience at all, it just added a new level of engagement to the gameplay. But I will admit that I am biased because Pikmin is one of those series that I will play until the day I die. If you haven't checked out the Pikmin games, I absolutely recommend giving them a go, and it doesn't matter if you play it on the GameCube, the Wii, or even the Switch, you're gonna have a great time. In May, we ended up getting a new Punch-Out game. Punch-Out is a series that I think a lot of people had forgotten about, and I played this before playing any of the older Punch-Out titles, and I absolutely adore this game. You play as Little Mac, you know, the character from Smash Bros. Who cannot jump, and you fight your way up the competitive boxing ladder, fighting a bunch of familiar faces from the original Punch-Out game. This is a great Wii game regardless if you're a fan of boxing or not, and I'm really hoping that someday we get another new Punch-Out game, because I will throw hands for it. The most important game that came out this year though was the return of Wii Sports with Wii Sports Resort. Now, this wasn't a simple upgraded version of Wii Sports, it was a brand new game that featured a bunch of brand new games that took the Wii experience to a whole nother level. Wii Sports Resort was built for the new accessory Wii Motion Plus. Wii Motion Plus plugged into the bottom of your Wiimote and allowed the Wiimote to be way more accurate than it was prior. Now, I'm not an engineer, so I don't really understand how it works all that well, but what I do know is that you needed to play Wii Sports Resort.
You wanna know what, Nintendo? I'm in. Take my money.
Now, the original Wii Sports had 5 separate games, where Wii Sports Resort has 13 separate sports you can play, with each of them having a load of different game modes inside of them. The fan favorite seems to be Swordplay, where you cut down various Miis across your path, and I don't know why it's so satisfying, but it's arguably one of the most fun games I played on the Wii. They also included archery, which is incredibly fun, you had basketball, which was incredible, and returning games like golf and bowling. So if you were a fan of the original Wii Sports, there was nothing stopping you from having even more fun with this game. This was also included in a lot of different console bundles, but for people like me who had already had a Wii, I sprinted to the store in order to pick this up because my Wii Sports itch can never be scratched. In August, we got the release of the Metroid Prime trilogy, which, similar to the new Play Control games, it brought Metroid Prime 1 and 2 into the world of motion controls for the first time, which allowed the games to play just like Metroid Prime 3, and this was an insane deal. 3 incredible games for the price of one, and they are full-length Metroid games, which made this one of the best deals on the Wii, especially for fans of Metroid, and it gave a lot of people who had never played the Metroid Prime games the ability to do so in the easiest way possible. If you have the opportunity, I highly recommend checking out all 3 of these games, and this is easily the best way to do it. In October, we got Wii Fit Plus, which is an enhanced version of the original game with a load of extra exercises to do, and for people who loved Wii Fit, this was a no-brainer to pick up. It had all of the content the original version had, and used the same balance board, but with all of the new features like the ability to count the calories that you're burning. It made this the premier way to experience Wii Fit. Now again, this is not the most entertaining game of all time, but compared to the original, there are some things that make it more fun. But if you're someone who's looking for a fun game as opposed to trying to go exercise, this might not be for you. But if you're trying to get in shape and you don't want to go to the gym, this might be a good place to start. In October, we saw the release of Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Winter Games, which is another Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games, but this time there was snow. Now, like I said before, I've been very harsh on these games in the past, but I've always had a soft spot for the Winter Olympic Games. There's something about snowboarding and skiing that I always found fun, even as a kid, but I'm far too much of a coward to go up on a mountain and try and do that myself. I'm not trying to get tied around a tree like a Christmas bow. But Mario and Sonic at the Winter Olympics took everything that was great about the original game and put it into a winter setting. There were so many different sports to partake in. Whether you were into skiing, snowboarding, or even bobsledding, there was something for you. Having a large collection of minigames that kept you somewhat active was really fun. And though I found myself playing this while sitting down more than standing up, it was a pretty decent workout if you play it for more than 10 minutes. There were a lot of these titles made over the years, and the Wii had probably the best selection. The ones on the handheld consoles just were not as good. But if you're looking for a fun game to pick up and play with friends, this is not a bad option. In November, we got Poke Park Wii, which is a fun little Pokemon side game, which isn't anything that's that crazy. You play as Pikachu and you go around trying to collect the 14 pieces of the Sky Prism, because Mew lost it and it's now Pikachu's job to figure that out. There were a load of different mini games and battles to go through, and overall, I can't say it was the best Pokemon game ever made, and it seems like it's one of those series that Nintendo has forgotten about, but if you're looking for an obscure Pokemon game to play, I can't say it's a bad time. And the second most important game, which arguably could be the most, was New Super Mario Bros. Wii. It was the first time we saw a new 2D Mario game get made for a home console in years. After the wild success of New Super Mario Bros. DS, Nintendo decided to try and make this game for the Wii, and they created something that was absolutely revolutionary. Just like in the older Mario titles, you were racing from one side of a stage to the other, jumping on Koopas and Goombas along the way and collecting coins. But this time there was the inclusion of motion controls with certain power-ups, and the ability to play with up to 4 players at the same time. You could play as Mario, Luigi, and 2 obscure Toads, because why would they ever let me play as Wario or Waluigi in anything? And they made a home console Mario experience that felt fresh and new, but also retained all of the charm of the older games. Now, the new Super Mario Bros. Games got done to death, but for the time, this was revolutionary because Nintendo had been so focused on making Mario and 3D adventures, it was like they had forgotten their roots altogether. And getting to share this experience with friends made it all the more special. And it even had a bright red case to make sure that everybody knew you were cool because you owned this game. But just like the last couple years, 2009 was an incredible year for the console. The return of forgotten IPs like Punch-Out was insane to see, and the new games like New Super Mario Bros. Wii and Wii Sports Resort are still looked at as some of the best games on the entire console. But after this point, the Wii started to slow down a little bit. That's not to say the latter half of the Wii's life cycle was bad, but technology was still improving at a rapid rate. And other consoles like the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360 started making changes that made it so the consoles were even more powerful, and people who originally only played on the Wii were starting to move to other consoles. But there were still a lot of games that came out in 2010 that made the Wii well worth it even into its later years. The first big game release came out in May with Mario Galaxy 2. Everything that was great about the original Mario Galaxy was improved with this game. The first Mario Galaxy game was revolutionary. It received near perfect scores pretty much across the board from reviewers, and Nintendo noticed they did something truly incredible, and they did something that I don't think anyone was expecting, and made a sequel to one of their 3D Mario games. Now this has not happened before or since this game, and as much as we all wanted Mario Odyssey to get a Mario Odyssey 2, it seems like as of right now this is the only 3D Mario game to get a direct sequel. And what a sequel it was. I look at Mario Galaxy as the perfect sequel. It took everything that was great about Mario Galaxy 1 and added new things to spice up the gameplay in ways that didn't make the original feel monotonous at all, and only added things that truly enhanced the gameplay experience. This time you got to ride Yoshi in space, and I think if you went back into 2002 and told somebody that, they might have a stroke. There are a load of great worlds, including brand new ones and some throwbacks to older Mario titles, with an atmosphere and soundtrack that were just as good as the original, and it made Mario Galaxy 2 not only the best game to come out for the Wii in 2010, but also one of the most important games on the entire console. Even though the Wii started to slow down in this time, it was truly a spectacular game, and if you have yet to play it, you need to. In August, we got Metroid Other M, which was definitely a game. Now, I know this is probably the popular opinion, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, but this game was truly terrible. Every Metroid game, whether it was 2D or 3D, had been good, but when I played this, I remember feeling it was bland all the way through. And I played it again recently, thinking maybe I was just biased by everything I had read online while playing it, and it was still just as bad as I remember. The level design was just painfully boring, and the dialogue and story were just as bad. I think this is why they ended up taking a pretty long hiatus between Metroid games after this, to give the bad press the series got from this game a little bit of time to die down. But I cannot be more serious when I say, do not waste your time playing this game. It is genuinely bad. But even though the first half of the year didn't have that many releases, the latter half of the year had a good amount of content. We had the release of Wii Party, which was a solid party game for the Wii. It played similarly to Mario Party, and even though it wasn't as good as Mario Party was, it was still worth checking out to a point. You had some fun games like Board Game Island, and even Bingo, which was decently fun. But as far as the Wii games go, this is not my favorite. I would much rather play Wii Sports or Wii Sports Resort than touch this game with a 10-foot pole, but if you're someone who's into the Wii library of games, you should definitely check this out. Also in October, we got Kirby's Epic Yarn, which took our cute pink puffball friend and turned him into yarn.
What do I do with this, floss?
To be 100% honest, Kirby's Epic Yarn is one of my favorite Kirby games. Long before Yoshi ended up getting the crafted DIY feel, we had Kirby doing it. I guess you could say that Kirby was a trendsetter. Kirby gets sent to Patchland and is made entirely of yarn. It's a typical side-scrolling Kirby game, but because he's made of yarn, Kirby can't suck up enemies and use their powers anymore, he now has to use yarn on them. And even though that kind of goes against everything that Kirby was built up to be, it doesn't immediately make this game bad. There are still times where Kirby gets to use different abilities, where he can shapeshift into different forms throughout the game, but if you're a fan of the 2D Kirby games and want to try out something new, this might be something that's worth checking out for you. In November, we saw the release of Sonic Colors, which was arguably the most popular Sonic game that came out for the console. Sonic Colors was a good blend of 2D and 3D Sonic, but it definitely leaned more towards a 2D Sonic game than anything else. Of course, you play as Sonic, but this time he's in space.
I wonder where the Sonic team got that idea.
And his goal is to stop Dr. Eggman from being the worst as always. There are these interesting creatures called wisps that give you different abilities, and even though at a lot of points it feels like a good Sonic game, there are also a lot of points in the game where it doesn't feel like a Sonic game at all. Whenever I would become a wisp, it would really take me out of the gameplay experience altogether. It slowed down the game, and when I'm playing Sonic, I don't want to go slow, I want to go extremely fast. That's not to say this is a bad game by any means, but if I'm gonna reach for a Sonic game, I'm probably gonna end up picking something else. Also in November, we got the release of Donkey Kong Country Returns, a brand new Donkey Kong Country game. I'm a huge fan of the Donkey Kong Country games, and this is not my favorite game in the series, but that doesn't mean it's bad. When you think of a Donkey Kong Country game, you think of a game that is painfully difficult. And this game was, but not for the same reasons as the older titles. Now, there was a long time between the release of Donkey Kong Country 3 and Donkey Kong Country Returns, and there were a lot of things to love about the new Donkey Kong Country. First, the graphics were absolutely insane. No matter what console Donkey Kong Country ends up being on, they always have some of the best graphics on the entire console. But one of the things that made the older Donkey Kong Country titles so great is how responsive and fluid they were. Whenever you would play them, the games felt incredible. The platforming was tight and it always felt responsive, but that wasn't the case with Donkey Kong Country Returns. Precision and motion controls don't really work that well together. So with Donkey Kong Country Returns, they made a good Donkey Kong Country game, but it was held back by motion controls almost entirely. It's still a great game and I highly recommend checking it out, but maybe don't play it on the Wii. And 2010 wasn't a bad year for the Wii. As far as volume of quality releases, the console was definitely slowing down, but with games like Mario Galaxy 2 and Donkey Kong Country Returns being added to the console, you can't say it was a bad year by any means. But it was around this time we started hearing the first rumors about the successor for the Wii coming around the corner. But there still was the entire year of 2011. And though it was a slower year just like 2010 was, it still had a good amount of notable games that kept the Wii alive and well, with the first game releasing in February being Mario Sports Mix. Mario Sports Mix was a collection of different Mario sports games that weren't big enough to be their own standalone releases, bundled together to make one game. There were a couple different sports you could play like basketball, volleyball, dodgeball, and hockey, all of which were decently fun. Now, none of these games are going to be anywhere as deep as a traditional Mario sports game will be, but this is more similar to something like Mario and Sonic at the Olympics, where it was a collection of games that offered a good amount of content to keep you playing, but there was nothing to really keep you hooked for the long term. But what it lacked in content, it made up for by having Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest characters in the game, which is an interesting idea because I love seeing Mario pair up with franchises that they have no business pairing up with. But if you're into Mario sports games, this is not a bad game to pick up. I just don't think that any of these games are that incredible on their own. But to get them all together for one price is not a bad deal. Then there was a pretty long break, but in October we got Kirby's Return to Dreamland. Unlike Kirby's Epic Yarn, we now had the ability to suck in enemies, and it was just like it used to be. Except this time you could do things that were not possible, like hit someone with a giant cleaver. I love Kirby games, and I think a lot of people share that sentiment, and Return to Dreamland is just as good as any of the other games. For people who were expecting Kirby's Epic Yarn to play like a more traditional Kirby game, this was a great change of pace. Getting back to the original Kirby action of sucking up enemies and taking their powers is something that a lot of people missed. And the fact they didn't get that with the last game gave them all the more reason to pick up this game and enjoy it. It's a Kirby game that plays just like a lot of the older Kirby games do, so if you're a fan of that, you're gonna love this. And there's also the option to play co-op mode, which is even better. So if you've never played it, Kirby's Return to Dreamland is a great time regardless of who you are. Whether you're playing with friends or by yourself, it's gonna be fun.
Oh, it's gonna be by myself.
In November, we got the release of two pretty solid games. First, we had Mario and Sonic at the London 2012 Olympic Games, which was another Mario and Sonic game, and if you're not a fan of the Winter Olympics, then this is the one I would recommend getting. It has all of the fun sports events that you've come to know and love of the older titles, but with graphics and gameplay that feels more modern and flushed out than the older games did. Though there are a lot of recycled events, they do play a little bit differently, but if I had to recommend one Mario and Sonic game to get for the console, it would probably end up being this one. Then again, give it 2 months and that opinion might change, because I can barely decide if I like myself or not. Also in November, we saw the release of Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. Skyward Sword is a very controversial Zelda game. Some people absolutely love it, and others think it's the worst thing ever. But it definitely did a lot of things that were different from the traditional 3D Zelda games that fans had come to know and love. Just like Twilight Princess, it had a focus on motion controls, except this time there wasn't a GameCube version to balance it out. So you were forced to play this game with motion controls if you wanted to play it, until somewhat recently when it released for the Nintendo Switch, which made it way easier for anyone to access the game. But in the Wii version, there were a lot of controversial game design choices that made it not that fun. Beyond the motion controls, the biggest issue a lot of people had was Fi. She would pop up and just ruin the flow of everything and give you a hint that was not very helpful, and the fact that there was no way to turn off this hint system was really annoying and it took you out of the flow of the game. But if you could get past those flaws, Skyward Sword had one of the best stories in all of Zelda. If you're a fan of Zelda lore, this was the game for you. And if you're gonna play it, I'm not gonna suggest you go back and play it on the Wii, unless you want this blue lady popping up into your face every 2 minutes. If you have a Switch, I recommend getting it on that, but as a certified Zelda fan, I have to recommend it. And the last major release for 2011 was a game that I don't like to talk about because it enrages me to no end, and that is Fortune Street. Similar to Mario Party and any other board game video game hybrid, Fortune Street is a board game video game hybrid that plays on the home console.
And it stinks.
Yeah, me and Fortune Street don't have the best relationship. What's cool about it is you play as a bunch of Mario and Dragon Age characters, so there is a solid variety of characters to choose from, but my problem is that it's too much like a board game. If I wanted to go play Monopoly, I would just play Monopoly. And yes, that's an oversimplification, but at the end of the day, Fortune Street just isn't for me. But if you are a fan of board games, this would be something you'll like.
But just so you know, You're wrong for that.
But the Wii was slowly wrapping up during this time. There were some more games that came out in 2012 we're going to talk about, but that was the last major year for the console. And 2011 was a little bit slower, but it did have some pretty solid games. Getting games like Skyward Sword and Kirby's Return to Dreamland were really solid entries, but even Helen Keller could tell the console was pretty much done at this point. But that led to the last major year of the Nintendo Wii's life cycle, 2012. And it started in March with the release of Mario Party 9. Now, I will say this is better than Fortune Street, but as far as Mario Party games go, this was
bad. Like, really, really bad.
Until the release of Mario Party 9, the home console Mario Parties had felt very similar. They all followed the same format where you roll your dice, move around the board, collect stars and coins, and overall just have a good time. But Mario Party 9 decided it was going to change the formula a lot, in ways I don't really understand to this day. Instead of moving individually, all the players share one cart and you move to the end of the board. The dice now roll from 1 to 6 instead of 1 to 10, and there are no longer coins, there are mini stars. You still retain all of the fun mini games, but the formula itself got changed way too much for a lot of people's liking. And I'm not going to say Mario Party 9 is bad, but if you're looking for a typical Mario Party experience, it's not what you're going to get with this title. In April, we got the release of Xenoblade Chronicles, and I'm a big fan of Xenoblade, but I don't think this is the best console to play it on. I would rather play Definitive Edition on the Switch, but if you play it on the Wii, you're not going to have a bad time. I'm a big fan of RPGs, so this was absolutely for me, but if you're not an RPG fan, you might not enjoy this. The world building and story are incredible, so if you're a fan of anything RPG, I am certain this is a game that will be for you. And in September, we got Kirby's Dream Collection. Just like any collection of older games, this was a collection of Kirby's oldest and best titles, all packaged together neatly on the Wii. It includes a bunch of Kirby's best titles, and overall, if you're a fan of Kirby games, this is not a bad deal at all. It even has Kirby 64 on it, which is one of the best Kirby games ever made. So if you're a fan of Kirby games, this was the perfect title to pick up. But 2012 was really the last year of the Wii's life cycle. Sure, there were games coming out for the Wii all the way until 2020, which is something that is actually insane to me. But the Wii U released in 2012, which led to most of the first-party Nintendo games being put on that console instead. And though the Wii U wasn't as successful as the Wii was, it still was a great time. But maybe it's just my nostalgia, but I think the Wii was something truly special. It bridged the gap between gamers and non-gamers, and it helped reduce the stigma around video games being only for kids or lazy people. The ability for anyone to pick up and use the Wii easily, combined with the engaging titles they released for the console, made the Wii one of, if not the most special consoles ever made. What's your favorite Wii game? Let me know in the comments, and as always, thank you for watching. I hope that you and your family have an incredible day, and if you like anything you saw here, please consider subscribing.